So, welcome back to the Contrarians. We're back at it again. We've got another Dark Horse panel for you today. Today, we're going to be talking about the band Europe and the album Wings of Tomorrow. So, if you like the Contrarians, if you like talking about rock and metal and that sort of music, you can join the discussion in the comments. You can give a like, you can give a subscribe, you can tell your friends. There's other ways to support the channel in the description as well. But most importantly, you can watch this episode, and I'll thank you for doing that in advance. So, thanks. I'd like to also thank our panelists for being here today. We got a great panel. I'm sure they're going to let you know lots and lots about the band and the album, but I've got a little bit of very, very, very brief notes here just to set the stage. So Europe is a Swedish rock band. They were formed in 1979. Probably, I'm going to guess, maybe a lot of you at home know them the same way I know them from the Final Countdown, the song that everybody knows, which is also their third album, which in 1986 sort of made them internationally famous. But we are not here to talk today about that album. We're here to talk about the Dark Horse album, its predecessor, Wings of Tomorrow. So each of our panelists is going to go around. We're going to go around to each of our panelists, and they're going to give a review about the album, a little bit of context and history, and then they'll give a rating out of 10. And at the end, we will see what the panel's overall thoughts were. So without any further ado, I'm going to go over to Pontus first. Pontus, what are your thoughts on Wings of Tomorrow?
Well, this is interesting because Europe, of course, was formed in a local community called Upplands Väsby, which is 3 Scandinavian miles from where I'm at the moment. I'm in the south of Stockholm in a place called Enskede. And it's 3 Scandinavian miles from here they were formed, and they actually worked very much. They were a band from that town. And the first thing about that, and actually explains the sound a bit onto this record, is what the first thing was that they were not known as Europe. They were known as Force. Not as Rising Force, because Rising Force was Yngwie Malmsteen's band, but Force. And Force, they were called because they liked the album Force It by UFO. And Europe, they were named because of Made in Europe. So that's the backbone of that. So here's a band that is truly inspired by both Deep Purple and UFO, and it truly shows. And also a bit of Thin Lizzy thrown in there. Wings of Tomorrow, February 1984. I think I saw the album in record shops. I've heard Open Your Heart on radio. I remember reading about them in the major youth magazine at the time called OK here in Sweden. And I remember seeing a show. I'm not really sure if it was live or if it was telly. What I remember is seeing On the Loose movie, where a few songs from the Final Countdown were premiered, and so Rock the Night in an early version. But going back to this album and listening to it today, which I did, I'm very proud of it. I mean, I'm very proud as a countryman, as a fellow Swede, because this is a good album. It is very, it was produced by Leif Masses. It was made by the quartet of the album, the quartet of the band, Joe Tempest, vocals, a few keyboards, a bit of guitar. You had John Norum on guitar. You had Tony Remo on drums, and you had John Norén on bass. And that was the original lineup. They made the first album in 1983. Actually, they won a competition. So they, in the prize of the competition in 1982, which gave them a record contract. It was called Rock SM, which is the Swedish rock comparisons with that. They won this major sort of local. They were local bands, then they were national bands, and they won the whole thing. So they became a major band quite early on. And the album starts off with Stormwind, which is just a fine example of the UFO influences. You can imagine this being a melodic sort of thing about lights out and things like that. And you have Scream of Anger, which is a really rocking number, which is, if you can imagine, Kill the King or anything like that, speed it up a bit. And then you have Open Your Heart, which is a great ballad, a great radio-friendly ballad, really. And they revisited that on Final Countdown as well, but this version is far better, in my opinion. And you have the whole album has this sort of feel to it that it's the 80s, but it's not, the flashy 80s. It's the 80s it's the 80s of Heaven and Hell and Number of the Beast, that sort of sound. It's just fresh and raw, and the band is on. And I really like the album. I mean, Dreamer was a great ballad. I've heard it on radio. When they performed it live, they used to play it a cappella. There is Dance the Night Away, which is, another song like, Lost in Hollywood or something like that. It's very sort of, you can hear the influences of the great bands like Blackmore. You can hear the influences from Rainbow. You can hear Schenker. You can hear a lot of them. But they had this melodic thing that Joey Tempest had, that he could write good songs, from the beginning. He was a great songwriter, and he's more aggressive. So I would love to see, Final Countdown was a major album in an AOR setting, but this was more punchier album, and I really love it. If I would give it a rating, I would definitely go for a 8.5. So I love that album.
Awesome. All right. Starting off strong. Thanks, Pontus. So we're starting with an 8.5. Let's go over to Tim next, and we'll get your review of Wings of Tomorrow.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, that was I love the fact that we actually have someone Swedish on here to talk about the band. That's really cool that they're started so close. I knew they were from Uplands Vasby, but that geography wise, that doesn't mean much to me. So that's cool to get it kind of an idea of where it is in terms of Stockholm. So Europe, I would have been 12 in 86. And in North America, like so many other people, I heard of Europe with the Final Countdown. I actually remember seeing the video a little bit sooner than I started hearing it on the radio, because our Canada's version of MTV was called Much Music. And on Friday afternoons at that time, towards the end of 86, they started to simulcast the show from the UK called, I think it was called Sky TV or Sky Channel. And it was a music, like an hour-long music program. And for a good, 5-6 weeks in a row, they played this video, The Final Countdown. And it was just around the time I was getting into bands like this, like when Bon Jovi were first hitting big. So I was kind of developing a taste for the sort of commercial, a little bit harder rock than than most of the top 40 stuff. So Europe were just kind of the right band come along at the right time. So I got The Final Countdown, and a lot of people I knew had the Final Countdown album. It had Rock the Night, it had Carrie and Cherokee, and that just, that was a huge album. It title song, I think, went to number 8 on Billboard, even though Carrie went all the way to number 3. So Final Countdown was not their biggest song, but it's the one that's gone on to have that life beyond the band. It's used in sporting events. It's like a "We Will Rock You." It's a song that will outlive all of us, outlive the band itself. It's just become, one of those pop culture moments. But I got into the band, and I've followed the band ever since. And I think that the albums they've put out since they reunited, like from 2004 on, have been some of their strongest. Like Start from the Dark and Bag of Bones, War of Kings, all really solid stuff. But rewinding back to springtime, I would say springtime of 1988. I remember I grew up on the border of, the Canada-U.S. border, right up in New Brunswick and Maine. So I would go visit relatives of mine that lived in Maine, and I'd always hit up the department stores because they have different variety of music than they did on my side of the border, especially in terms of older stuff. And I remember hitting the cheapo bins, the $4.99 tapes, $3.99 tapes. And I remember being very surprised when I found this cassette right here. And I knew from reading Hit Parader that the Final Countdown was not the first Europe album. I think most people thought it was over here, but I actually read that it was their third. And so I knew that there were other albums to be on the lookout for. I just didn't think I'd ever come across one. So I found this. Of course, I bought it without knowing any of the songs on it. And I absolutely loved it right from the first time I heard it. It's different. It's a different production sound than the Final Countdown. It's not nearly as slick. Leaf Massis, I believe, engineered Led Zeppelin In for the Outdoor, if I'm not mistaken. I think both of those albums were produced at ABBA Studios, Polar Studios in Stockholm. But it's got a really good, it doesn't sound like it's a huge budget production, but it's a fine sounding album. It's really well produced. Stormwind's one of my favorite album openers of any album. I just think that sets the scene. And that really kind of sums up the album because it is a little heavier than what I was used to hearing from them, but it's still very melodic. It's absolutely very, very, very melodic. Scream of Anger surprised me, though. It was so fast and so heavy, and I wasn't expecting a song like that to come out of Europe, but I liked it. It's got the double bass and the chorus. And Open Your Heart, when that came on, I remember thinking, wow, it's funny. I remember this is early 88. I remember thinking, they should do with this song what Whitesnake did with Here I Go Again and re-record it, and it might be a hit. Well, I was half right. They did re-record it because later that year Out of This World came out, and that was the second single. And it wasn't a hit. It wasn't a hit here anyway. Their North American success kind of began and ended with the Final Countdown. They got a little bit of airplay with Superstitious, but they didn't tour over here that much, which I think kind of prematurely brought their career to an end as far as Canada and the States goes, unfortunately. But as far as the rest of the album, Treated Bad Again is a good heavy one, and Aphasia, the last song on side 1, is one of my favorite instrumentals ever. I remember me and a buddy of mine, we'd have like these long video game sessions, and we'd always make mixtapes of instrumentals and play those in the background while we're playing our video games. And we'd always have like Def Leppard, Switch 625, Dokken, Mr. Scary, just different ones. But Aphasia was always one that we would put on there. Dreamer's a funny one because I remember seeing an interview with the band probably circa 1987, and it was outdoors, and they started singing this "He's a Dreamer" a cappella, and I didn't know what it was. I remember thinking, wow, they can sing really good together. So then when I got this cassette and I heard the song, I'm like, oh, that's what that is. That's what they're singing. And it was kind of cool because I knew a lot of people that had the Final Countdown, but I thought, well, nobody has this except me. It was kind of a fun thing to find. When I finally found, I ended up getting the CD. I had a special order. It's not easy to find, but when I ended up getting the vinyl, it's interesting because, well, it's got these pictures in it that's not in the CD, but the vinyl lists the same lineup that was on the first Europe album. And the copy that I have, this is not a North American copy. I don't know if it's from Sweden. I I can't tell where it's from. Eyesight's not great anymore. But anyway, so it lists Tony Reno as the drummer, whereas the CD and the cassette, these are both US versions. They list the band as it was on the Final Countdown, which is, with Ian Haugland on drums and also Mick McKelly on keyboards. So the original record actually lists who actually played on this album, and I didn't know that for a long time. So I don't know why they did that, but I don't know. Maybe they reissued this after the Final Countdown, even though it still says 1984 on it. I don't know the answer to that, but a great album. And this is a band that in general, I think people need to, I understand that, that specter of the Final Countdown is a big hurdle, but that's not representative of their overall sound, whatever you might think of that song and album. There's a lot more to this band. They're heavier than you might think. And they've got a lot more albums than you might realize they have, especially in recent years. Unfortunately, they just don't get the press that they should on the North American side. But Wings of Tomorrow has always been one of my favorite albums by then. I'm going to give this one a 9. This is a great album that I've enjoyed for many, many years.
Wow. All right. A 9. We got a very strong start then. Thanks, Tim. That was great as always. Let's go over to David next. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, guys. Happy to be here. I was going to say Tim stole my notes because I'm going down my notes and Tim's just rattling down my notes. But so I won't do too much review here. But similar, I think my timeline is similar to Tim. So being in the U.S., of a certain 14, 15, around 86, 87, the introduction to Europe really is the Final Countdown. So down here we had MTV and Headbangers Ball every Saturday. So, we're fixated on that. A lot of the introduction to bands at that time for me was one of two places, either those 3 hours of videos on Saturday night or the local hard rock metal station KNAC here in Los Angeles. So those are the two ways that I'm getting, and of course friends, they find the record, hey, check this out, right? But so I think like Tim, my introduction to Europe is the Final Countdown. And again, like Tim, I can recall finding Wings of Tomorrow in probably a bargain bin cassette rack at a department store or record store, and kind of, having a sense maybe that they had other albums, but not really totally sure, because, like a lot of bands, there was a sense because they were just breaking here in the United States that they were a new band, really, and they had some history behind them, not unlike Whitesnake. I think, when Whitesnake hit here with the 87 record, a lot of people thought they were sort of in that way, a new band, but really it was later that I realized they had this entire catalog to go back to, and maybe a little to a lesser degree the Scorpions, but really the Whitesnake's really the one that stands out, similar, that they have this huge catalog, but really here's Coverdale, who's a decade older than John Bon Jovi, but they're really presented as contemporaries, and here's this new band, right? And it's like later you realize it. So Europe was kind of like that, and when I got a hold of Wings of Tomorrow, it was, as much as I liked the Final Countdown, I liked Wings of Tomorrow way better. It was heavier and more riffy. And I think as I, got to know the record later, it made sense that, at that time, the lineup didn't include Mick McKelly as a full-time member. I think he came on board maybe to tour that record and kind of eased his way in, but it's not as heavy keyboard, certainly from a production standpoint. With the Final Countdown, bring in Kevin Elson, who's, done Journey and all these bands at this huge Night Ranger and all these bands. So he's going to have that very polished, slick, to use the term that Tim used, really to make that record a lot more polished. And Wings of Tomorrow, to me, just lends itself more to my taste. It's a little bit heavier, I think, and it sort of shows the evolution. I mean, when I got a hold of the first record, also has some really, really good songs, but I think this shows their evolution as songwriters, just as a body of work. It's just one after another. I don't think there's a dead spot on this record. I don't think there's filler on this record. Not even the instrumental, which a lot of times can be a skip. You get a record, it's got an instrumental, maybe you skip it. But like Tim said, that's a really, really good melodic song that it's not a skip. It comes on, it's not a skip, so it's, strong. Even the instrumental is super strong. So really strong record for me. And I found myself gravitating toward this as much as I listened to the Final Countdown, really Wings of Tomorrow more so. Every song just, I think I probably wore out multiple cassette tapes. And on the, looking at this, I was looking at this today and I hadn't pulled it out in a while, but the American copy of Wings of Tomorrow has the Final Countdown lineup on the back. It's got a paper sleeve, but it does have so I'm guessing maybe this thing was repressed or reissued after the success of the Final Countdown. They went back and repressed it and pushed it out into the American market and just used the current lineup. But so it can be a little confusing if you don't know that the guys on the back, they're listed, really weren't in the lineup at that time. But like I said, super strong record. One of my favorites. Trying to pick a few favorites is difficult. Stormwood, Wings of Tomorrow, Lion Eyes are all songs that stand out for me. But again, there's not a bad track on this record. Open Your Heart is a strong ballad. It's really, really well crafted. So anyway, top to bottom, just a really, really good album. Maybe the best album of Act One. If I think of, like Tim mentioned, Europe has had this complete second act. I mean, they got 6 records that have come out since 2004, and they are incredible. Every single one of them is fantastic. I think the most recent one, Walk the Earth. If you don't have it, go get it. Walk the Earth. I think the last time they were in the United States, I saw them on the War of Kings tour. They came here, which was great because I think, as Tim mentioned, they didn't do a lot of touring here. So back in the day, I think I only saw them open for Def Leppard. They did a run with Def Leppard and they had an opening slot. So really that was the only exposure I had to see Europe live until, recently. So really sporadic. So I think that maybe affected their ability to stick. And, but yeah, I would say if anybody listening is a fan of Europe, do yourself a favor and dig into the second act. Really, those 6 records from Start from the Dark all the way through, Walk the Earth that came out in 2017. They are really, really good. So I think it's almost a tale of two bands because the new records are not the Final Countdown all over again. I mean, they've evolved. It's still Europe. It still sounds like Europe. And the songwriting is strong, but they're different. So, I think of it almost as 2 acts, but I think Act One of Europe, really, I don't think you can find a better record in the catalog, top to bottom, than Wings of Tomorrow. I'm giving it a 9.
Awesome. Well, thanks, David. That was great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've got a pretty strong reaction to the album so far. Last but not least, let's throw it over to Reed, and we'll see if he agrees or if maybe he's got a contrarian opinion. Reed, what do you say?
All right. Well, I swear, people, in my daily life, I am not that guy. That just appears to be the role I've been assigned in the Contrarians group. But before we go there, Pontus, I need to know, is there a difference between a Scandinavian mile and another mile? Because you always qualified it. What's a Scandinavian mile?
Scandinavian mile is 10 kilometers.
Oh, geez. Okay. All right. I have no idea why you need your own system of measurement, but
no. I don't know why other people use other measurements, but we do. And this is actually why it's called the Scandinavian mile. I think it's because it's Sweden and Norway who does this. So I just looked it up because I wanted to see the difference, because we call it an English mile, the opposite.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that's a point.
All right. Thank you. I have learned something today, and not just about the band Europe. So I don't even know that Wings of Tomorrow was actually on sale in 1984, at least, in North America. But if it was, in my little corner of the world, nobody owned that album. The final countdown just seemed to spring out of nowhere with these guys singing with apparent sincerity about ninjas and the plight of the Cherokee, and of course, taking off into space. And at the time, I thought that Europe was pure bubblegum. They were the album that posers bought, right? If you wanted to act like you were edgy and into metal, you bought Europe. But real metal fans were like, give me a break. You know, we were listening to the early Megadeth and Metallica, and we were listening to Iron Maiden and, Wasp. I think Manowar, although these days I find Manowar silly. There's probably a show we can do one of these days. But so I never really followed Europe. I followed John Norum because I think John Norum is a smoking guitar player, and he showed up on Don Dokken's solo album From the Ashes. And then later on, I am a Glenn Hughes completist. I probably like Glenn Hughes better than any other singer on the planet, and he was on John Norum's solo album Face the Truth. If anybody hasn't heard that, it's good. Glenn Hughes and John Norum works just as well as you think it would. So it wasn't until the 21st century that I mellowed enough as a music fan to decide to go back and give older Europe a try. So in some ways, I was pleasantly surprised by Wings of Tomorrow. In some ways. I think the album sounds exactly like what it is, which is a group of really young guys very early in their career recording a moderately budgeted heavy metal album in the mid 80s. It has that sound, right? There's too much reverb on the vocals. The drums are not particularly aggressive, especially for a heavy metal album. I spend the entire album going, why are the drums so low? Some of the guitar tones are really good, and some of them are really buzzy in solid state. I don't know what kind of rig John Norum was using, but there's like two main guitar parts on Scream of Anger, and one of them is really like buzzsaw sounding. It's very digital, and it's annoying because there's a much better sounding guitar laid on top of it. I was very surprised to see that every track except the instrumental was written by Joey Tempest. I'm not even going to try his real name. I thought that Norum would have had more writing input. Obviously not. Norum wrote the single instrumental track on the album. But when you listen to the album, it's really apparent that this is the case and that Joey Tempest has not yet figured out how to write a catchy riff. He's a melody guy, right? So his songs are arranged for vocal melodies, and they're kind of there until solo time, and Norum puts in some fantastic solos. But the rhythm parts they're okay, the exception of two songs. Now, I know nothing about Europe's history, but I'm so glad that Pontus talked about them being influenced by UFO, because my two favorite tracks on the album, I look off to the right, this is where I've got my notes on another computer. Treated Bad Again and Dance the Night Away are my two favorite tracks. They're the two most aggressive tracks. They're the two tracks that have the most prominent riffs, and they are so UFO. And that's what I put in my notes as I was going through this album, is these tracks sound like heavy UFO. So thank you for validating that opinion, Pontus. I feel like an actual human being now. But for the most part, the thing that really strikes me about this album is that Joey Tempest has not yet figured out how to really nail his vocals. Now, he's got a very good voice, but he's one of those strange singers who, for me, he sounds better when he's singing in the upper register. And most of this album is more of his mid-register, right? And in fact, there are several songs where he's got backing vocals. I think both he and John Norum do the backing vocals, but the backing vocals are in a very high register. And if you're listening to it on a good set of headphones, I think, you know what, those backing vocals sound better than the main vocal track. And I wish he were doing the entire song in that higher register he has, and then using the lower register for the backing vocals, but that's not how it's recorded. And then when we get to the actual song, Wings of Tomorrow, I don't know how well this would come through if you're listening to an MP4 or watching it on YouTube or something, excuse me, an MP3, or watching it on YouTube or Spotify. But if you've got a good audio source and you're really listening to it, Joey is all over the map vocally on this track. He's gliding up to notes. He's gliding down from notes. He's got this vocal whammy bar just going crazy. And it's not a style that he normally uses on his later albums. So I feel like he's experimenting. He's finding what works. He's finding what doesn't work, but it annoys the crap out of me. I wish he would just hit his notes and hold them. And he does that later. So again, this is a young person's album. This is the album of a guy who's 21 years old, and he's going to get better as he goes along. He's not there for me yet. That said, I think there are some killer tracks on this album. I said the guitar solos are fantastic. Interestingly, as I was listening to this album, I thought, you know what this album sounds like to me? It sounds like Dawkins Breaking the Chains. That's what the production sounds like to me on this album. And then I remembered, wait a minute, Norum played on a Don Dawkins solo album. So maybe Don thought that same thing. Breaking the Chains came out in 81. I know it was distributed in Europe. Maybe it was an influence on Europe. I have no idea. In any case, the tracks that are the most obviously influenced by Schenker era UFO, I think, are the best tracks on the album. So, and 2 ballads. That's pretty unusual for an album in 1984. The mandatory power ballad. Now, this is a bit of an old man's memory, right? But I don't think that in 1984 there was mandatory power ballads yet. I think of that more starting about 1986, where every big album that came out had the rocker and then the power ballad, because you had to have that crossover appeal to really sell albums, right? So having 2 ballads on an album in 1984 is pretty unusual. And I think Joey sings the best on those. He gives himself the most vocal space. There's not as much of this overpowering vocal reverb. So they're just arranged a little bit differently. But then when the solos come in, I'm like, man, Norum can really shred, but his solos feel out of place to me. You know, I feel like he's just sitting there waiting in the wings, smoking his cigarette and going, okay, it's time to play. And then he just rips off a solo. So I like the album. I probably would have liked it more if I had gotten into it as a younger metal fan, but compared to other things that were on the market at the time, these days I give it a 7.
All right. Well, awesome. Thanks, Reed. You lived up to your role. All right. So gonna hit calculate here and we'll see what we've got. We've got an average of we'll round that up to 8.5. Why not? So 8.5. There you have it, folks. We've got 4 great reviews there. Some really high praise. And some middling praise, some begrudging praise, we might say. But I think it's fair to say that the panel is in general in favor of this album. So we'll treat that as a recommendation. Go check it out. And if you're like me and your only really experience was the Final Countdown, it's good to know that maybe there's something a little bit heavier for us to check out. So we'll have some homework. That's fun. Except for those of you who, already Europe fans. I'm sure you knew about this one already, and you can let us know what you think about it in the comments below, because that's where the second conversation is, which is always a great time. If you like the Contrarians, if you want to be part of the Contrarians, there are ways to support the channel in the description. You can like and subscribe. You can share with your friends, but most importantly, you can just keep watching. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. This was a great conversation. I want to thank you at home, the fellow Contrarians, Marco and Martin, and if it's night morning or day. Have a good one. Thanks, everyone.